Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. A senior editor of National Review and a columnist for the New York Observer, Richard Brookhiser grew up in Rochester and graduated from Yale. He is the author of nearly a dozen books, including What Would the Founders Do? And, most recently, George Washington on Leadership. Rick Brookhiser is also one of the finest prose stylists in English, an opinion that I shared with Rick's hero and mine, the late William F. Buckley, Jr. Segment 1, Why Should We Care? The founders lived in an America in which the population was roughly 1.3% of the population today, in which the principal means of transportation was the horse, in which the big source of energy was the water wheel. Why should we care what the founders would do?
Well, a lot of what they dealt with we're still dealing with. I understand we're in the midst of a presidential election. I've heard that said. Well, they had the first few. They started that system, and we've maintained it for over 200 years. We are in the midst of two wars, depending on how you count
how you slice them.
Right.
You mean Afghanistan and
Iraq,
right.
The war on terror, maybe it's one big war. But, and of course, they lived in a world of war. They fought the Revolutionary War, and there were wars before and after that many of them were involved in. And then finally, human nature does not change that much. The passions of men remain what they were. They spent a lot of their best thinking about those questions. So a lot that was on their plate is still on ours.
According to Bob Woodward's book, State of Denial, a few years ago, when President George W. Bush was feeling especially frustrated with the post-Saddam government in Iraq, he asked, quote, "Where's the leader? Where's George Washington? Where's Thomas Jefferson? Where's John Adams, for crying out loud?" Close quote. Well, where were they? Why did America produce figures such as these when neither Iraq nor any other country I can think of has produced such figures?
Was he saying that about Iraq or about himself?
You may pursue that if you wish, but let's assume at first that he was saying it about Iraq.
Well, look, we had the United States, the 13 colonies. Before it was the United States, it was part of the English-speaking world, which had been absorbed with political upheaval and the questions that arise from it for 100 years, going back to the English Civil War. And this had produced a lot of thinking about society, how society should be run. You know, John Locke was very involved in what became the Glorious Revolution. He was sort of a spinmeister for, William of Orange when he finally triumphed. So they were growing up in a culture that had done a lot of thinking about this and that also was free enough that it encouraged discussion. And so that was part of their heritage.
So if you say the population of the United States in the first census of 1790 was about 4 million, roughly the same as the population of Kentucky or Louisiana, that makes these figures look very singular. Adams, Jefferson, you won't find them in Kentucky today. On the other hand, if you say, wait a moment, they were continuous with the English-speaking world. They were in the tradition of Milton and Locke, and Burke would write the Reflections on the Revolution in France. That makes it
they're not all
intelligible somehow.
Right, they're not all by themselves.
Right, okay. Segment 2, the Founders and the Constitution. During the administration of George Washington, Secretary of the Treasury Alexander Hamilton supported legislation to establish a national bank, and that started a fight. And the founders disagreed quite vehemently on the constitutionality of Hamilton's proposal. Mm-hmm. Very briefly, if you can crunch that one down to 40 seconds or so.
Well, you had two people who had been at the Constitutional Convention, Hamilton and James Madison.
Right.
And they were partners in writing the Federalist Papers. So this is about as authoritative as it gets. And they disagree on the constitutionality of the national bank. And Hamilton says, look, the Constitution gives the government the power to, to handle commerce. and various other things which require a bank. Therefore, it is implied that we can do this unless it's specifically forbidden, which it isn't. Then Madison says, well, no, if you reason that way, you're going to have the government be able to do almost anything, because you could have a chain from A to B, and then B to C, and then so on to Z. So here at the very beginning, the infant is still in the cradle, so to speak, and these two godparents are struggling over it.
Right. Now, Seth, I'd like to ask you to do exactly the same in sort of a 30-second treatment. Washington and Madison also have a constitutional dispute. Is that not right?
Well, they have one. There is one on.
You're dubious of Madison's position.
No. There is one on who gets to have a say on treaties.
Right. That's exactly
whether
right.
the House of Representatives has a role.
Yes.
And a treaty with Britain called Jay's Treaty has come before the Senate. The Senate has approved it by the narrowest of margins. But Madison, who is a Francophile, wants to block it. He thinks he can block it in the House, and he says, well, look, this treaty is going to require the spending of money. That's the province of the House. Therefore, the House has a say. And Washington privately says this is preposterous. And his attitude was, look, I was in Philadelphia too, and no one, at the Constitutional Convention, no one ever said anything of the kind.
So here we have two instances: the debate over the National Bank and this dispute between the dispute between Washington and Madison is, to me, is especially striking because Washington presides over every session of the Constitutional Convention.
And Madison is also there.
Madison is also there,
Right.
and we regard him as the principal drafter of the document.
And they were such tight friends that during that period, James Madison was getting his mail at Mount Vernon. He was spending so much time at Mount Vernon, people sent their letters to him there.
Now, listen to Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Quote, "The theory of originalism gives the Constitution the meaning that its words were understood to bear at the time they were promulgated." Close quote. Is it a problem for the originalism of Mr. Justice Scalia that George Washington and James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, men who were at the convention, disagreed on what the document meant?
Well, I think you'd have to have an originalism that will accommodate those disagreements. I mean, if you're committed to originalism, you do have to understand that you have certain original disagreements that have maybe still never been ironed out.
Right.
And you have to be mindful of that. Now, at the same time, there are also things that none of the founders contemplated or would have thought of. We speak of Hamilton, I think rightly, as the big government guy among them. And yet he thought that in order for the federal government to pay for roads and canals, which he wanted them to do, there'd have to be a constitutional amendment. So you see, even Hamilton was not willing to take his notion of implied powers to say, well, the federal government does have the power to pay for roads and canals.
Right.
So he thinks we do need a constitutional amendment in order to get this.
Right.
Now this has gone by, say, the 1830s, when Henry Clay and Daniel Webster are proposing.
Well,
to do
so
this.
then in a certain sense, the disputes among the founders, the particularly arresting disputes because they were among men who were present at the convention, in a certain sense that undergirds Justice Scalia's own treatment of the Constitution, because if you look at the way they reasoned when they were disputing, none of them said, well, that may have been very well and good for 6 years ago when we ratified the document, but it's a living document, we must adjust it. They were all engaging in quite tight originalist lines of argument, really, weren't they?
Originalist.
Is that fair?
Well, originalist, but also based on their understandings of the nature of government. Certainly Hamilton was willing to say all governments by nature can and must do certain things. So we have to be guided by that understanding as well as the particular constitution that we've established for ourselves.
So there's certain premise that is an antecedent to the document.
That's right.
All right. Okay, now to wrap up this question, you've got the originalism of Justice Scalia. Now listen to Justice Stephen Breyer. Quote, "Why should courts try to answer difficult questions on the basis of logical deduction from text or precedent alone? Why not ask about the consequences of decision-making on active liberty?" the originalism of Justice Scalia and the consequentialism of Stephen Breyer. Where would the founders have, let's put it in a milder way, toward which would the founders have inclined?
Well, they might ask Justice Breyer, why do you care about liberty? Where'd you get that from?
Segment 3, the founders and what George Washington called bountiful providence. Let me quote you to yourself, Rick. This is in What Would the Founders Do? Quote, if the founders did not make America a Christian nation, many of them thought it should be a religious nation. Now, would you explain both clauses of that sentence?
Well, they did not. Look, and they all came from particular colonies which became states. And a number of those had religious establishments, and a number of those maintained their religious establishments even after the First Amendment was passed.
By establishment, you're speaking in a strict legal sense. You're not
Yes.
talking about a group of people who had influence. You're talking about a church with legal standing.
Taxes are collected in order to support the clergy of
Right.
a particular
Okay.
church. Because states, the First Amendment was not incorporated for the states until the Civil War amendments later. But the United States has many religions in it, even in the late 18th century. They're almost all Protestant of one sort or another. I mean, there are a few Catholics and there's even a tinier number of Jews.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, when people are arguing among themselves, it's like this kind of Protestant versus this other kind,
Right.
and this could get very acrid. I mean, they hanged each other, you know, not so many decades previously. So there was a sense, both in terms of political theory and also just in terms of pragmatism, that we're all in the same boat together, and we have to learn how to, you know, split the difference here. And so their behavior, and then the First Amendment, when it's promulgated and passed, reflects that, meaning that there will be no national establishment of any denomination.
Right.
But in terms of the other half of it, America being a religious nation, let me take Washington as kind of a central figure. He was, you know, by birth and by practice to some extent an Anglican or an Episcopalian. He'd been a church vestryman. He'd been baptized and married in that church. He does not seem to have been as passionate about it as some of the other founders were in their religious beliefs. But he does say over and over again in his private and his public pronouncements that providence plays an active role in the whole founding experience. He talks about the astonishing interpositions of providence. That's one phrase during the Revolution. This is language he uses over and over again.
I was struck in reading Washington on leadership. Washington took it as a kind of ground of his thinking. His fundamental premise was that much would be expected of him. He owed duties to his countrymen, to his family, to the people with whom he did business, and that was the kind of providence in which he believed. Providence demanded good behavior of him. Now,
It's not
did you
like,
read that? Is that a fair reading?
in contrast to someone who thinks he has a star that
Yes,
will
yes. Napoleon.
Yes, right.
Right. Okay. Now, well, I have to ask you to be brief, but this is such an important question. I've so wanted to ask you this question. I'm going to ask it anyway. Two views of how we end. I will overstate both to make the point, to frame the question, but two views of how we end up with the First Amendment, with distance between the state and the church. View one. This is a profound intellectual insight arising from the Enlightenment. And this view associates it with Jefferson, who in his letter to the Danbury Baptists writes about a wall of separation between church and state. One, they reasoned their way to it. Two, David Hackett Fisher in Albion Seed says, wait a moment, the revolution is a tremendously important moment. But what they're seeking to do in all kinds of ways is ratify arrangements with which they've already had a couple of centuries of experience. So in a certain sense, this refusal to establish a religion ratifies this kind of strange, jerry-rigged system that has grown up in the colonies, where Boston is Puritan and Connecticut is Congregationalist and Maryland is Catholic, and they've all learned to live with each other and respect each other and carve out a certain sphere of private influence for each other's colonies and indeed for each other's thinking. So one is blazing intellectual insight that arises straight from the Enlightenment. The other is a ratification of experience, lived experience.
Well, maybe the way to reconcile that is that there were different enlightenments, and some enlightenments took experience into account. Montesquieu was he was the most often referred to thinker at the Constitutional Convention. Someone is counted.
All right.
Not
All
me,
right.
but
I
someone.
wasn't aware of that. I would have guessed Locke. All right.
Someone is counted, and,
All right.
and they called him the celebrated Montesquieu. Like that was his first name. Celebrated Montesquieu. And as we know, Montesquieu was very much that kind of a thinker, a historian as well as a political philosopher. So it's not necessarily, those two views are not necessarily in conflict.
All right. Segment 4, a republic or an empire. Thomas Jefferson in 1823, quote, he's an old man. He's had plenty of time to reflect on this. Our first and fundamental maxim must be never to entangle ourselves in the broils of Europe, close quote. Today, the United States has the biggest armed forces in the world by a large multiple. We have an enormous military presence in Europe. We are entangled in their broils. Also in Asia, more recently the Middle East. Would the founders have approved of the current state of affairs, or would they have been appalled?
Well, let's take Jefferson. Shortly before he said that quote, he's writing to his pal James Madison, who's just been inaugurated as president, followed him in the office. And he says, we can get Cuba and Canada. He says, Canada will be a mere matter of marching. And then he says, then we will have such an empire for liberty. Empire for liberty as the world has never seen. So, maybe he didn't want to get broiled in Europe, and there were lots of reasons not to in his lifetime.
He didn't mind snookering Napoleon, though, to add the Louisiana Purchase.
Well, but that was over here,
Right.
And that was in his backyard, and he grabbed for that when the chance came up.
Right.
And that wasn't all. He thought we'd get Canada and Cuba, which we never have got. We had Cuba for a few years, and then we let it become independent, and we never were able to take Canada. We tried. We tried a couple of times. So even he had that ambition. Washington certainly uses the phrase "this rising empire" over and over. He uses it at that dramatic moment at the end of the Revolution when he's appealing to the almost mutinous officers in Newburgh. He says, do not deluge this rising empire in blood. He sees a great future for America, which is not only great morally and great politically, but great in terms of its size and power.
How was he using the word empire? Did he mean it the way we use it when we talk about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is a collection of quite different peoples held together under a system of government but also of force? Or did he mean it something more analogous to what we now think of as having been the British Empire, which is a system of language and thought and a kind of culture?
Well, I think he means a political entity of imperial extent and power. I think that's the basic meaning there. And obviously it can't have a monarch, because we've done that, and he refused, sort of a bumptious offer that came his way from one of his officers. So we're not going to have a king. There will be no emperor. But for this to be a superpower, that is something he hoped would happen.
No problem. Dirty trick, but I can't resist. Invasion of Iraq? Specific question. Would they have approved?
If they thought there was a threat to us in Iraq being uninvaded, well, yes. Jefferson fought a war with Islamic countries in North Africa. And he actually broke the policy of the Washington and Adams administration, which was to pay them off, to leave us alone.
Right.
They went the negotiation route. And for good reason, or not to bad reason. But
the cheapest way out of the problem.
Cheapest way out of the problem. They're running a protection racket. We pay them, then they won't raid our shippings and enslave our people that they capture. But Jefferson becomes president. He's been dealing with this question since he was minister to France. He's been dealing with it a long, long time. And we sometimes think of Jefferson as a pacific man, but he says, I've had enough of this. Enough is enough. And he sends a fleet over to the Mediterranean, and then it goes on. He uses force, then he negotiates.
Right.
And then the treaty he negotiates doesn't hold up. So then Madison has to send a second fleet over in the Madison administration, and then finally the problem ends. But there's a problem that goes on through the first 4 administrations, and it went on even before the Constitution. It's a long-running problem.
Okay, now President George W. Bush, has offered 2 rationales for the war in Iraq. One was that the regime of Saddam Hussein represented a threat, direct threat, to our own security. The other is that we need to spread democracy to be true to our own mission. Listen to Bush's second inaugural address. From the day of our founding, we have proclaimed that every man and woman on this earth has rights, from the day of our founding, by the way, has rights and dignity and matchless value because they bear the image of the maker of heaven and earth. Advancing these ideals is the mission that created our nation. Now it is the urgent requirement of our nation's security. There we go back to the rationale that we have to do it for our own protection, and the calling of our time. And they're the rationale that we must because we're Americans. You've addressed the first rationale. They would have whacked Iraq if they thought it represented a threat to this republic. What about the second?
There you would have seen some disagreement. Governor Morris, who's in some ways my favorite founder, and he's not...
And the title of your book about Gouverneur Morris is?
Gentleman Revolutionary.
Gentleman Revolutionary.
The rake who wrote the Constitution.
All right. Add that to your pile of Rick Brookhiser books.
And he was a cynic, and he was an experienced cynic because he lived for almost 8 or 9 years in Europe. And part of that time, he was a businessman in France, and then he was our minister to France during the French Revolution. And he was at the first meeting of the 3 estates when Louis XVI got this all going, and then he leaves when Robespierre has been toppled. So he sees that whole swatch of history. And his attitude towards the French was that they were like a vicious horse in a cart, and they needed the whip and the spur to tame them. So could France ever have free institutions? Not really. Maybe a little freer, but they're just not like us folks.
Right.
Okay, so that's one view. I think there were other founders who would say, well, yes, even France can have freedom.
Jefferson particularly.
Well, Jefferson thought they were going to have it right away.
Right.
But even I think even some of those who were very skeptical about the French Revolution would have said, well, this is a bad way to go about it, and this is not going to work. But they wouldn't say the French can never have it. They would say, look, you got to, try again. And all we like to laugh at, how many different French regimes there have been, but the 2 longest ones were the Third and the Fifth Republic.
Third is?
From 1871.
Louis Philippe?
No, the Third Republic, 1871 to 1940.
Right.
And then the Fifth is 58 to now.
Right. So they have actually, after a delay of almost a century, even the French found democracy. All right, so there'd have been a range of views about human nature and about the extendability of democracy and American ideals.
About the extendability of democracy, maybe less about human nature, because they did refer to the laws of nature and nature's God, and that having universal application.
All right. Segment 5, the founders and politics. Rick Brookhiser in What Would the Founders Do? Quote, sick of attack ads, spinning, mindless partisanship, The founders hated it as much as you do. They also invented it. Explain.
Look, if they came back now, you know, if they were looking at the 2008 election and we briefed them on 2000 and 2004, I think they'd say, this is better. You know, the tone is just, it's just better. It's just kind of nicer, and it's not as mean as it was when we were around. I mean, when people, it kills me when people moan and groan about how awful and ugly it is. And it is awful and ugly. It really is. But I say, read the political literature of the 1790s. I mean, it was just berserk. It really was.
Talk about going negative.
And part of that is it's all brand new.
Right.
And, you know, you don't know the first time that if your enemies come in, that they'll be willing to leave.
Right.
You know, your theory may say, well, yes, they will.
Right.
But you haven't done it yet. So when the first two-party system emerges after the Constitution is in place, and this is the Federalist Party of Washington, Hamilton, John Adams, and then there is the Republican Party of Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, which is now the Democratic Party.
And they've divvied themselves into these two parties in practice before the end of Washington's second term. Is that not right?
Yes,
right.
It already begins.
So this happens just like that.
It's a few years and then they're off. And part of it's foreign policy and part of it's domestic policy, but they have these disagreements. And, you know, and they really don't know. I mean, the Federalists think, you know, if these people come in, they'll just want to bust up the whole government.
Right.
Hamilton writes that, you know, the stakes in this election, I think he's talking about 1796, is laws, property, and of course heads. You know, he just tosses off that reference to guillotines in the French Revolution, right. Just like tosses that off. And then, you know, Jefferson believes that Hamilton is a monarchist, you know, which he isn't. But Jefferson really believes this, that Hamilton, you know, he's only putting up with the Constitution for the time being. He really wants it to be a monarchy. So there's this, you know, there's this kind of...
They really only had two models to choose from, in effect. Britain or France. They didn't have their own model yet.
Well, they didn't know that they had
didn't know it. Right,
I mean, they really
right.
did, and they really were working on it. But I mean, you know, here it's a little country. Here are these two superpowers with their gravitational fields. Everything is new. This world war is raging, and you know, that just makes you feel uncertain and insecure. And the response to that is almost lunacy.
To present-day politics, Henry Adams, great-grandson of John Adams, actually to present-day politics by way of the late 19th century. Henry Adams, great-grandson of John Adams. By the way, your book on the Adams dynasty is called?
America's First Dynasty.
America's First Dynasty. Add that to the bedside stack. All right. Henry Adams, writing on the presidential politics of the late 19th century, quote, "The progress of evolution," I love this one, "the progress of evolution from President Washington to President Grant is alone evidence enough to upset Darwin." Okay. Washington to Grant, Grant to Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. Repudiate the argument that that's an unbroken decline.
Well, look,
if you will.
Let's just start with Henry Adams, whom I love, but you do want to wring his neck, you know, half the time, and partly he's upset that it's not Henry Adams, it's Grant in the White House.
Right.
You know, who are these Grants coming into the family inheritance? And, you know, Grant's presidency is being revived upwards, even as we speak, and for a variety of reasons.
And he had broken Lee, which was not an inconsiderable task.
Well, no, his military genius ought to be unchallengeable, and people are finally figuring out that he was at least an okay president, not in the cellar where he's been for a while. But you know, part of it is, again, that it's not just the leaders who are in the picture here; it's also everybody else. So if we don't, you know, if we don't like the class of leaders we have, the fault is not only theirs. I mean, we put them there. We really do. They are not there because they are the nephew of the Duke of so-and-so. You know, they're there because they got elected, and they got elected because we and our friends decided to do that. So we always have a responsibility. And if we're really that unhappy with it, then we ought to do some reflection about ourselves. The other thing is, people do respond to crises and challenges. I mean, you know, Abraham Lincoln was a kind of a slick railroad lawyer from Illinois, and most people think he did pretty well. Franklin Roosevelt was from a sort of a broken down Hudson River aristocracy, minor sprig of the Roosevelt clan, and many people think he did all right. So, you know, and there may even be people who look back on George W. Bush and his response to 9/11 and you know, revise their opinions of that.
Okay, Rick, final couple of questions, alas. And now, instead of talking about George Washington or writing about George Washington, as you do brilliantly and enjoyably in George Washington on Leadership, you are George Washington. And I am, let's say, Lafayette, someone in whom Washington confided. So let me name 3 names and ask you, General Washington, to give me a candid sentence or 2 on each. George W. Bush.
You must never take your hands off the wheel.
John McCain.
We share the same flaw, which is temper. And you're older than I ever got. So I could never make it go away, and neither will you. But what we do is we learn to step back from it and make decisions on the basis of our rationality, not our temper.
Barack Obama.
You have great communication skills, which were different than mine. Play to those advantages. You know, never throw them away. But communication is not the only thing you will need. You also have to back it up with a consistent record of your deeds.
Last question, General Washington. We presume you're now 300 and some years old and still a registered voter. In November, for whom do you intend to vote?
John Adams said of me, shortly after I died, that Washington possessed the gift of silence.
Richard Brookhiser, author of many wonderful books, including What Would the Founders Do, and still more recently, George Washington on Leadership. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson at the Hoover Institution for Uncommon Knowledge. Thanks for joining us.